This is in real-time speed. Ready, go. Okay, the fiber internet and the cell are already done. And you can see HF radio still chugging along. And there we go. It took 6 minutes and 47 seconds to send one block over HF radio. Bitcoin would not need the internet if blocks were 300 kilobytes, would just broadcast over HF radio. Is this claim true? No, it's not. And I'm going to walk through exactly why. I wrote an article on my website, sampat.com, and this video is just going to talk through this article point by point and show you why Bitcoin can't work over HF radio. So, everyone knows that Bitcoin is magic internet money, but not everyone is convinced that you need the internet in order to use Bitcoin. So, longtime Bitcoiner NVK recently tweeted what I just showed you. He continues saying that just like your Casio watch, you can get the time from nuclear clocks automatically. We could have low-powered wallets and pretty much anything without internet. Truly decentralized, speed of light. This is a great vision, by the way. I love radio. I'll talk more about why it can't work over HF radio, but radio itself is an amazing tool to empower people, and it is peer-to-peer. It is truly decentralized. It's great. But Bitcoin over HF, it's not going to work. Now, NVK does know his stuff. He's been running a Bitcoin hardware company for ages. He's a prominent technical voice in the community, and he is a licensed amateur radio operator. In fact, he was the first person to send Bitcoin over HF radio back in 2009. And I'll talk more about this transaction later, but it was really neat. And it proved that you could do this at a very, very small scale, but not at the scale you would need to actually run Bitcoin seriously. Also, NVK is not the only person who has taken this seriously. Others like Nick Szabo have done some experimentation with Bitcoin over HF. Back in 2017, he gave a really interesting presentation at Scaling Bitcoin, which if you're interested in the subject, I suggest you go ahead and watch that video. It's been a few years since then. I messaged with Szabo over X way back 2017, 2018 to see if they were going to continue doing this. He wanted to, but never, I don't think ever followed through. So as far as I know, no one's really done anything with this since the 2017, 2019 time period. But that tweet that I showed you at the start was just a few weeks ago in October of 25. So the idea isn't dead. It still comes up every once in a while. And the short answer to the question, is this possible, is no. The long answer is, if you define using Bitcoin as being a passive observer of the network, sitting on the sidelines, not interacting, then yes, it is possible. But my argument is that is a bad definition. And that is not a use case that should dictate Bitcoin's design. In other words, you should not be changing Bitcoin to limit the block size even further in order to allow Bitcoin to be useful over HF radio. That does not make sense. Explaining this just with numbers would be kind of boring. So I made some visualizations, like this one here, to show you why this is not a good idea. Okay, so let's start with talking about why you would want to use radio at all. Well, Bitcoin was created to be peer-to-peer cash originally. The decentralization and the trust minimization of the design of Bitcoin are the entire point. So it's a way for people to be able to move money around without needing to rely on existing financial institutions. You're trying to avoid those points of control, empower individuals to handle their own money. Doesn't the internet work for this? Well, in practice it does, most of the time. In theory, less so. So if you want to build a decentralized network that minimizes trust, then you need an underlying decentralized network to use, right? If you're building on top of something that is not decentralized, you can't really build a network for payments that is uncensorable. So the problem is the current internet isn't fully decentralized and it can't be fully trusted. So just like banks act as points of control and surveillance in the financial system, the internet also has many points of control and surveillance too. So it's really easy to imagine that the electrical impulses that come out of your computer are, connected directly to the other computer that you're talking to. The signal is going from one machine to another, because that's true. That is how it works. But along that path, there are many physical points of infrastructure that are neither party controls. And they're being monitored by various organizations, your ISP, other companies, governments, of course. Most of those organizations don't care that you're using Bitcoin. And most of them would never take steps to stop you from using Bitcoin. But they could if they wanted to. Bitcoin's allowed existence so far is not a guarantee in the future. And if you look at authoritarian regimes today, throughout history, they typically demand full control over the money supply and the financial system. The physical infrastructure of the internet is completely vulnerable to state-level actors. And we already see this in countries like China. And as Snowden showed us more than a decade ago now, Western governments are not idle online. This is why radio is so compelling, because it bypasses all of those points of control. The signal is emitted from one antenna, goes through the atmosphere, it's received by another antenna, right? Completely peer-to-peer. There's nothing in between. It's as decentralized as it gets. So NVK is right when he says truly decentralized speed of light. It's a beautiful vision. I love it. Having the underlying communication network being peer-to-peer at the most fundamental level possible. And to be clear, I support this vision. This post is not about why radio can't be used to empower decentralization, or even why it can't be used for Bitcoin itself, because I think it can. But why HF radio specifically, this particular portion of the spectrum that I'm going to be talking about, why it's not sufficient. It just isn't. Okay, so why listen to me? Well, I've been involved with Bitcoin for a long time. I was a senior policy analyst, and I ran a tech policy program at a think tank in DC for a while. And while I was there, I wrote one of the first books about Bitcoin. This is back in 2013. I left and I co-founded a Bitcoin company in 2015, and we built a decentralized marketplace called OpenBazaar. And I've been a licensed amateur radio operator, like NVK, for even longer than I have been a Bitcoiner. I got my ham license at 14 years old. I was obsessed with number stations, which is a really interesting subject if you want to look into it. Back in my teens, I spent all kinds of time tuning the shortwave band, trying to find them. I've logged hundreds of long-distance conversations. The furthest I've talked to is South Africa, which is about 8,000 miles, using only 100 watts of power. And you can do that with modern data modes. It's amazing how far we've come, even since I've been a ham. I was also the first person to receive Bitcoin over HF radio. So that transaction that I talked about earlier, that NVK did, where he sent the first Bitcoin, I was on the receiving end of that. He was in Toronto. I am in Michigan. It was, I think, about 400 kilometers. And it was a really fun, really interesting experiment. And that experiment gained a little bit of traction online. It got some attention. So I was later invited onto a show called School of Block as their technical expert to help explain what we did and help recreate it. The video was really interesting, really well done. So if this subject interests you, I highly recommend you go ahead and give this a watch. Now, kind of a disclaimer here. I'm not a Bitcoin Core developer. I'm not an electrical engineer, a radio engineer. If you are those things, and if I'm saying something that's oversimplified or just wrong, my apologies. Go ahead and contact me. You can find my contact information here, and I'll try to correct it in the article. Okay, regardless of my experience, I love this subject, so let's dive into it. The main problem of using HF radio for Bitcoin is limited bandwidth. Well, what is bandwidth? How much bandwidth do we need? let's very quickly talk about how Bitcoin works to understand how much we need. So the easiest way to understand Bitcoin is to view it as a distributed ledger to keep track of digital money. And then combining that with everything else that you need to maintain such a ledger. A ledger is a series of blocks linked in a chain, the blockchain, all the way back to the first transaction in 2009. So these blocks are individually quite small. Right now, the average block size is about 1.5 megabytes, and they're only added to the block approximately every 10 minutes. So if you're coming to this video and you're not familiar with Bitcoin, then you would be forgiven for thinking 1.5 megabytes every 10 minutes is just not much data at all. Well, the block size has been an extremely contentious subject in the Bitcoin community. Many people believe it should be even smaller than it is today. Many others believe that it should increase. I won't go into the block size wars of 2017. There was a whole battle. It wasn't pretty. But the main thing to note here is that blocks are limited to about 4 megabytes in the foreseeable future. They're never going to be larger than that. So 1.5 to 4 megabytes every 10 minutes. Where's the bandwidth problem? There isn't one for the internet or even for most forms of radio communication. So I'm going to show you some visuals to explain why this is. If you already have a solid handle on the fundamentals of radio, you can go ahead and skip to the speed comparison section later. I'll make sure there's chapters in the video. I'm going to go into how radio works at a pretty fundamental level first. All right, so 3 terms that are important to understand: frequency, bandwidth, and modulation. And for many years, I didn't really understand these. It was outside of my intuitive grasp. I knew how to use those terms in communicating with the radio, but I didn't know what they really meant at a fundamental level. And at some point, I saw some visualizations people did, and it really helped it click for me. So I put some together for you. First, electromagnetic fields are really strange things. They can be static, like an electrical field around a charged balloon, or a magnetic field around a magnet. But unless you interact with or you move those fields in some way, they just sit there. They just sit there. If you connect to a DC power source, to an antenna, you make a static electric field and a magnetic field that can be measured nearby, but it doesn't radiate. It just sits there and it fades with distance. So if we look at this example here, this is an antenna and it has a DC, a direct current charge on it right now. And it just has these fields that are sitting there. They're not moving, they're not radiating, they just sit there. Okay. But what happens when we hook this up to AC, an alternating current? Well, that makes the electrons inside the antenna accelerate back and forth really quickly. And that changing electric field propagates electromagnetic waves outward. They're not bound to the antenna anymore. They radiate outward at the speed of light. So those fields we call electromagnetic waves. Notice that we can detect these waves when they interact with matter, such as another antenna over here. Okay, so if we reset this and we start, these waves propagate outward, and once they touch this antenna over here, it induces a voltage. So those oscillating fields that drive the electrons in the sending antenna, the oscillating voltage that is driving that is turned into electromagnetic waves, and then the same thing happens in reverse at the other side. Those waves then drive the electrons in the receiving antenna in that same rhythm that we see over here, and they create an alternating voltage that we can measure over here. So, to understand frequency, bandwidth, and modulation, all you need to do is follow this oscillating voltage line through time and watch how it varies. So, first, frequency. If we look at that voltage line, you'll see electromagnetic waves primarily as sine waves. Okay? Just this really simple up and down. The most fundamental aspect of these waves is how frequently they complete a cycle. Okay? And all the way up and down cycle. So it'll go from peak to peak. Peak here, peak here, peak here. Okay. That spacing, the distance between peaks, the frequency of the cycle is called frequency. And it's measured in hertz, this symbol Hz, hertz. That means 1 cycle per second. Now, 1 hertz is really slow. Basically, everything you'll ever talk about on the electromagnetic spectrum, when you talk about frequencies, is going to be in the thousands, tens of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions, billions of hertz, right? Always. Because electromagnetic waves can oscillate very, very quickly. So the essential idea here is that higher frequency means more opportunities to send information. Okay? And to understand that, we need to know what a carrier wave is, which we'll talk about in a second. But to think about this relationship easily, this slider here goes from 1 hertz right now. And if you bring it up here, you see now it's operating at 11 hertz. 11 times a second this is oscillating. And that's 11 chances to send information. And as you increase the speed of the oscillations, you get more chances to send information. Okay. But it's important to understand that a sine wave itself doesn't give you any information, right? What is the signal of this wave? There is no signal. It's just a pure sine wave. It's a line that moves up and down predictably, though. And that predictability is really important. Because if you want to send information, you just need to send this sine wave, which is called a carrier wave, but then change it a little bit. And that little change is where the information is actually in the signal. So we call alterations to those signals modulation. So you have this carrier wave, this sine wave that you're creating with the sending antenna, and then you just change that wave a little bit in a certain way. And over on the receiving end, they know what a sine wave looks like at that particular frequency. And when they see something that differs from that, they know there's a piece of information there. And that modulation is the change. Okay. So if the receiver knows the frequency of the sender's carrier wave, right? They know the distance between the peaks on the voltage line. They already know that. Then they can look for any variations away from that perfect sine wave. Anything that deviates is the underlying information. There are various ways to do this. Modulate the carrier. All of them can be visualized by looking at that voltage line that we talked about. All right, so let's do that. If you vary the height of the wave here, that's amplitude modulation. Okay, so in this visualization, the carrier reference is a dotted line, right? So I'm going to move this down here. Okay, this is that perfect sine wave we talked about, right? If you have amplitude modulation, then the height of these peaks is what you're changing to encode information. So when I change the modulation strength, you can see this carrier reference in the background, that was the pure sine wave. Well, now the signal we're sending, the modulated signal, differs. See how there's gaps here? Here, the modulated signal is higher than the carrier reference. Here, it's lower. Well, the receiver knows what a perfect sine wave looks like, and it notices the difference. And that's where information is encoded. That's not the only way that you can encode information, though, to modulate the carrier signal. If you vary the frequency away, that's called frequency modulation, or FM radio. You guys have already heard of these. AM, amplitude modulation, AM radio, FM, frequency modulation radio. This is how they work. So if you shift the line, if you vary the frequency, right, you vary where these peaks are, that is FM modulation. And you can see it can be pretty extreme. There's another type of way to modulate called phase modulation. This is where you change sort of the timing of where the peaks happen. And then there's another quadrature amplitude modulation, QAM, which kind of combines phase and amplitude together. Okay. So the difference that emerges between these lines is the information of the signal. All right. Now, what is bandwidth? Now, notice before, if you crank up the modulation strength, you deviate from the carrier quite a bit. right? You can get pretty far away from where the original carrier is. The more significant that deviation becomes, the further away the modulated signal reaches from the carrier frequency. That distance from the original sine wave is called bandwidth. It's directly related to how much information can be transmitted. Okay, so I have to tell you that the frequency visualization earlier is a little bit misleading. It's not literally true that 1 hertz is 1 bit of information. That's just a convenient way to think about the relationship, but it's not literally accurate. The Shannon-Hartley theorem tells us that the data rate of a channel depends on the bandwidth and the signal-to-noise ratio, not directly on the frequency. So you could be using a lot of bandwidth. You could have a signal that deviates from the carrier a lot at a really low frequency. But practically speaking, that doesn't really happen, and I'll explain why in a minute. The opposite does, though. It's very common at a higher frequency to have signals that have a lot of bandwidth because they have the space. So frequency doesn't itself directly increase the data rate, but it does give you more space for your modulated signal to deviate further and further away from the carrier signal, or to have multiple carrier signals in parallel near each other. All that extra space, bandwidth, means you can pack in way more data. Okay, so the next visualization shows you what happens when you increase bandwidth. Note that in the visualization above, if we increase the frequency all the way to 100 hertz, that was 100 chances to send information, right? So we go from 0 up to 100. It's just a direct relationship. Okay, but in this visualization, when we expand the bandwidth of the signal, we get many more opportunities. Okay, so here we have this center frequency, 1 hertz. We can increase this all the way up to 100 again. That's 100 chances. But then if we increase the bandwidth, now we have 2 sort of channels of information being sent, and the chances go up to 200. And this just continues based on how many lanes you have open. So the higher the frequency and the more the bandwidth, the more chances you get to send data. Now, there are multiple ways to use bandwidth. The original way I described it, where you have 1 carrier wave, and then bandwidth is the deviation away from that carrier wave. That's like a single carrier signal. You can have multiple carriers in parallel, which is more what this visualization is showing. Details don't matter, but the basic idea is the same. You're using more spectrum, using more space. Your waves are taking up more space. And higher frequencies have more space to do that. So if you're operating at 100 hertz, extremely low frequency, and you use just 1% of that frequency for your bandwidth, you're varying from that carrier 1%. That means your signal has about 1 hertz total. You're going from 99.5 hertz to 100.5 or so. That is an extremely narrow slice. So you only have, 1 or a couple sort of lanes to be able to send your information. But if you're operating at 2.4 gigahertz, which is what Wi-Fi uses, and you have 1% of that frequency, then your bandwidth is 24 million hertz. Okay? That's a huge amount of spectrum that you're able to modulate, and it gives you millions of times more opportunity each second to modulate data. And this is why high-frequency systems can carry vastly more information. And the waves themselves aren't faster, but because they have wider frequency bands available to them, there's just more space up higher in the spectrum. So, HF radio operates at frequencies that are about 3 to 30 million oscillations per second, or 3 to 30 megahertz. That may sound like a lot, right? Well, 3 or 30 million oscillations a second, isn't that enough to get in the information? Back in the early days of understanding of radio, this was high frequency. That's why it's called HF, high frequency radio. Because the frequencies we were using at the time, like the AM broadcast band, were even lower. But at HF frequencies, you typically have about 2 to 12 kilohertz of usable bandwidth. And that is thousands of times narrower than the megahertz wide channels that are used by Wi-Fi, cell phone networks, satellites, other forms of radio that are much higher. Okay, so that's the underlying radio side. But what does this mean for speed, right? Well, let's talk about a few different modes of communication and how they compare on speed. One, we'll take fiber internet. That's sort of the best case. That is the fastest way practically to send information right now. Another category is line of sight radio. This is higher frequency than HF radio. This is what your cell networks use. This is what satellites use, like Starlink. And then the third, of course, is HF radio itself. We'll see how that compares. So the speeds across those modes vary a lot, but I kind of averaged out the numbers I could find online. Roughly 1 gigabyte per second for fiber, 65 megabytes per second for cell networks, 100 for Starlink, 150. I kind of averaged those together to be a category of about 100 megabits per second. Okay. What about HF? Well, that's not as simple. There's not one number that's as easy to use, but we're just going to take the number that NVK gives us at face value here. Right here, he says 12 kilohertz bandwidth, which ends up being about 50 kilobits per second. Now, there's an issue with that number. That amount of bandwidth on HF frequencies is wideband. That's kind of like the most bandwidth that you're able to use. And when I say you're able to use, I mean anyone's able to use, because ordinary ham radio operators can't use that much. We're just not allowed to. That's the sort of channel width that is used by shortwave broadcasters, militaries, governments, not individuals, right? Amateurs usually get between 2 to 3 kilohertz. Very small amount. So a modern wideband system that he's talking about can get to 50 kilobits a second under ideal conditions, but it requires a well-engineered, licensed, high-power setup with a good signal-to-noise ratio and forward error correction. Real-world setups that most people are able to actually use are an order of magnitude slower than this number. In practice, if you had a station that was operating continuously with 12 kilohertz of bandwidth, that would be a serious thing, a huge deal, right? So the numbers only make sense if you have a large broadcast facility, or if you're willing to go rogue, if you're willing to be like a pirate station. Could the international community be convinced to allocate 12 kilohertz of HF spectrum for a continuous Bitcoin block beacon, right? Is it possible you could have them allow us to set up this system correctly and broadcast 12 kilohertz of spectrum continuously? I don't think so. But let's pretend that it did happen. Let's pretend that this block beacon actually did happen. How fast would it be? Well, I made a visualization to show that. It's going to show how long it takes to transmit a single Bitcoin block in real time at the various data rates. So I randomly chose block 92315. It is about 2.5 megabytes. That's bytes, so that's 8 bits each. That's about 20 million modulation opportunities that we would need to send that data. As an aside, because of BIP152 compact blocks, if you share mempool data, you don't need to send full blocks, which saves a lot of bandwidth. But this would be a passive HF receiver. They're not going to have a shared mempool state. So for this visualization, I'm using the full block size. If that means nothing to you, don't worry about it. Okay. So how long does it take to send one Bitcoin block? Going to change the size of this visualization here. All right. So the first category is fiber internet. The second is the cell and Starlink. So basically line of sight radio. And then the last is HF radio. This is in real-time speed. Ready, go. Okay, the fiber internet and the cell are already done. It took 20 milliseconds, 20 thousandths of a second to do it over fiber. It took 240 milliseconds, about 1/5 of a second, to do it over a cell or Starlink network. And you can see HF radio still chugging along. So far, it's taken 20 seconds. So let's speed it up 100 times real time to give it a chance here. And there we go. It took 6 minutes and 47 seconds to send one block over HF radio. Not a great look. But, all right, that is a full block, right? And that's not what NVK was talking about. NVK specifically was suggesting 300 kilobytes block size, way smaller than what we have right now. And that would drop the time down to 48 seconds. Now, obviously, in modern times, 48 seconds to send a signal is extremely slow, but it is fast enough to ensure that someone would be receiving the blocks from a broadcast, and those blocks would not pile up faster than that 10-minute average generation time. So that would kind of work, right? Sort of. There's a few more problems with HF. Okay, so 2 more problems. First, most people interact with radio nowadays at way higher frequencies than HF radio. If you use Wi-Fi, cell phone, satellite, FM radio, it's all way higher than that 3 to 30 megahertz HF band. And their line of sight, meaning the signal has to take a direct path between the sender and the receiver. So this is why you lose GPS signals in the mountains, because they block the path to the satellites. It's why your Wi-Fi router might have problems covering your entire house. It's going to have issues getting through your walls. Stuff gets in the way of the signal. So that's a problem. Now, line of sight radio has that huge bandwidth advantage that we talked about, so it can send way more data. But there's a fundamental problem with doing that. The Earth is curved, right? The distance that a signal can reach is limited because you have to get over the curvature of the Earth. Now, one way you can do that is by making your antenna really tall, so you can get further around that curve. But obviously, there's a limit to how far that's going to work. So unless you're a satellite, or you're on a mountain, or you're in an airplane, or on a balloon, you're not usually going to get much further than 50 miles. And actually, usually quite a bit less than that, 20 to 30 maybe. So that's a problem if you're trying to send a long-distance signal. HF doesn't have that same limitation because the signal is reflected off of the ionosphere, which is amazing when you learn how this works. But let's go through this image really quickly. So line of sight signals like VHF or UHF. So here you have a radio transmission, it goes up, and if it's UHF, if it's a higher frequency signal, it just blasts right on through the ionosphere. VHF, both high and low, they're deflected a little bit by the ionosphere, but not enough to come back down to Earth. They still go off into space. But if you have HF, lower frequency signals, the ionosphere actually reflects that signal back down to Earth. So it can go a really long way. And then it can bounce off the Earth again and then reflect off the ionosphere again. So this skywave propagation can skip several times and you can go thousands of miles away, which is amazing, right? I've told you before, I've talked to people all over the world using this data mode, using this HF frequencies. It's really fun. It's really exciting to do. However, this comes at a huge disadvantage. First, HF radio is unreliable. So I don't know about you. Have you ever listened to a shortwave radio? Nowadays, it's not as popular as it used to be. But I have fond memories. Back as a teen, I had an old ICOM IC718, big old knob, and you just tune it around and hear what you can hear. Listening to who knows what. Well, half the time I didn't, right? It's unreliable. 1 minute you could be hearing like rough Portuguese, who knows what that was, Brazilian fishermen, I don't know. But then it would fade away. It would just fade out. You could no longer hear it anymore. Then you tune down the band to hear a Voice of America broadcast. Those are usually pretty reliable because they were operating at extremely high levels of power, huge amounts of power. Then you could try to read Morse code in the amateur bands, or maybe hear one of those elusive number stations, right? Try to record it, and then just as you start recording it, it fades out. That happened to me multiple times. So the HF bands, they're notorious for being closed or open. And that basically means whether or not the signals are going to reliably reflect off of the ionosphere or if they won't. And that's dependent on a few things. It's dependent on the time of day, the solar cycle, how many sunspots there are. There's a lot of different factors. It's sort of predictable. You kind of roughly know when it's going to work and when it's not, but it's never completely reliable. Never. That's not so charming when you're trying to send data, right? That's a huge problem when you're trying to send data. It makes sending a big single transmission of data, like a Bitcoin block, really difficult. So you have to put safeguards in place. Things like forward error correction and sending repeats. So you don't just send it once, because what if the signal fades while you're sending it? The other person might have lost even just a small portion of the data. Well, you need it all to be able to have the blockchain fully. So you send a repeat. Well, all of these things, you're trying to increase the likelihood of receiving the message to 100%, but given the medium, it's never really certain. And if you miss a block from one of these block beacons, what do? Right? It's just not simple to use an unreliable medium, especially if you have no alternative methods. If you were using HF and you also had a satellite backup and you also had, of course, the internet, no big deal. If you were reliant on HF, that would be a problem. Another problem, antennas aren't small. The lower the frequency goes, the longer the bandwidth of the signal is, and the longer the antenna needs to be. So your cell phone operates at frequencies that are so high that the wavelength itself is short enough that you can use an antenna that's printed right onto a chip. Really small antennas, centimeters. But HF antennas are not like that. Now, to be fair, that's partially because amateur radio operators tend to want to transmit as well as receive. So you use proportions for your antennas, such as a quarter wave antenna, which are more efficient than if you were only receiving. And that results in antennas that are very long, 7 meters or longer, sometimes, depending on the band that you're using. And ideally, they're 20 feet or more off the ground. So I built an antenna myself that I strung up between trees at 55 feet, which worked really well. But that's hard. Like, that's not easy, right? It's a hobbyist thing. A hobbyist can do it, but it requires resources, time, some knowledge. It's not simple for everyone to do. Okay, so if you're only receiving, then these antennas can be smaller. I wouldn't say they're still user-friendly. I think NVK might disagree with me. I talk later because he read this article. I gave him a draft to read, and he suggested that these barriers aren't as serious anymore. However, I think all of this still adds up to the same thing, which is that HF just isn't a practical system if you need to frequently exchange data. So it's a for a one-way broadcast, it can sort of work, but that's not what Bitcoin is. And this gets to one of my sort of key points of why HF doesn't work for Bitcoin. You can't be an active participant in the Bitcoin network over HF radio. So you have passive versus active participants. Being a participant in the Bitcoin network is not just about being able to receive blocks. That's hardly useful at all. And we already have an example of this. So in 2017, Blockstream, one of the most prominent Bitcoin companies out there, launched or rented space on, I don't know, a satellite or several satellites. There are multiple satellites right now that are broadcasting the blockchain from space. Now, first of all, this is not done over HF, to be clear. This is much higher frequencies, so they're able to send that data much more quickly. And they can send a lot more data. You can send the entire blockchain. They have enough bandwidth to do that. Now, it's neat that this exists. It's cool that you can actually do this. But to my knowledge, this is not really widely used. I looked at their repo. The last commit was over 6 months ago. And if you look at the marketing, basically, this is a backup to make sure that your Bitcoin node is updated in case of an internet outage. So this is a way for people who need to make sure they have the most recent version of Bitcoin. They can have a backup from a satellite. This does not replace the internet. That is not what this is. The blockchain right now is about 692 gigabytes. So you're obviously not going to get this over HF radio. It would take 3.5 years, right? Not going to happen. So that means that a user who is only a recipient of blocks needs to already have your blockchain synced to the most recent point before getting those new blocks over radio. That basically has to be done over internet. There's no other method that you can use to sync with this blockchain, this beacon. So you need the internet, first of all, to even get the blockchain. And then you decide, for whatever reason here, to switch it off and only get your blocks over HF. Okay? Now what happens? Well, not much, because you can't talk to the network. You have a read-only wallet. You're passive. You could receive new funds, not send them. And if you did have coins, you could watch them do nothing. The only time you would ever see coins moving in this situation, other than receiving funds, is if someone stole your private keys and your funds are, goodbye. Obviously, hope that doesn't happen, right? But let's visualize this, right? This is what the HF system would look like. A broadcast system, one service in the middle, broadcasting blocks out to all of these passive participants in the Bitcoin network. They don't do anything other than sit there and receive Bitcoin blocks. This is what the Bitcoin network actually looks like. All of these people are active participants in the network. They need to be able to send information to, not just receive it. Fundamentally different visions. And I don't think that we should be designing Bitcoin with passive participants in mind. Does not make sense to me. Okay, so other than a temporary backup against unreliable internet, that HF broadcast approach is useless. So what if we took a single step in the direction of active participation without requiring the internet yet? What if we actually sent transmissions over HF? Of course, this is possible. Data is being sent and received over HF radio all the time by amateurs, commercial stations, governments, militaries. It's not hard to imagine a Bitcoiner or even a small community of people doing this because it has been done. NVK and I did it. Other people have done it. But there's a huge chasm between doing this sort of handful of experiments and a system that could actually work at scale. Not comparable. First, this would require an immediate upgrade to antenna, power requirements, and radio equipment. It would not work like the Casio watch example that NVK mentions. It's just not true. It's very far from user-friendly today. And if you watch that School of Block video that I mentioned earlier, you'll see what I mean. You need to have certain equipment, and even then it's difficult. So I did share a draft of this article with NVK, and he suggested that the barriers of antenna size, power requirements are not as large today as they were in the past. So we can do a lot more with a lot less. And I have seen this myself since I got my license. Cheap software-defined radio, weak signal modes like JS8. HF is a lot more accessible because of those things. So he's right in that regard. I'd love nothing more than to see the barriers continue to get lower, but I suspect the fundamental constraints that we talked about are just never going to be practical. Also, I haven't really talked that much about the regulatory side. If you do care about that, you need a license and to use HF spectrum, and broadcasting Bitcoin transactions for commerce, as far as I know, is just not allowed. So it's one thing to do this sort of small scale experiment where there's no money on the line. If you're really trying to do this at scale and build an entire network on HF, I suspect that wouldn't be allowed. Which, hey, if you wanted to give it a go, okay, but then you're making all these users effectively pirates, and that's going to have implications. Okay, let's say you do it anyway, right? Who would be listening to your message? That Bitcoin block beacon we talked about, that's a broadcast. That's a one-way thing. It's not a two-way service. So someone would need to be operating a service to listen, take your transaction, and then relay it to the rest of the network over the internet. Problem is, the person running that service is a point of control, just like the internet infrastructure that we're trying to avoid. If the problem is we're trying to avoid reliance on internet infrastructure, then doing it over radio, if you still have reliance on the infrastructure, isn't really solving any problems. So this is true of the Bitcoin block beacon idea or the Blockstream satellites themselves. Someone needs to run that infrastructure on behalf of others. Okay, but if the point of radio is to connect people directly, no cables, no routers, no servers, why not cut out the point of control and just talk peer-to-peer? Why don't we have these Bitcoin nodes connected directly via radio? That is an appealing vision, and it is not impossible. Mesh networking already exists. But the thing about mesh networking is it's always line of sight radio. It's radio at these much higher frequencies. And to my knowledge, mesh networking has never actually run an entire decentralized network before. Tell me if I'm wrong, right? I'd love to see it. But again, that's at those higher frequencies. This is not possible on HF. The bandwidth does not exist. It collapses under scale. So some numbers. According to BitNodes, which keeps track of the network, there are about 23,000 Bitcoin nodes online right now. Every one of those nodes gossips, talks with its peers. You exchange transactions, blocks, you exchange a lot of information. If you look at the numbers, they're often using hundreds of gigs of bandwidth every month. You can't do that over HF, right? Even a single node's chatter would take months or years to transmit. So imagine all of these nodes, all of these communications happening would need to take place over HF. And as we talked about, there just isn't enough bandwidth. There simply isn't. The internet is completely necessary for the Bitcoin network to function. Okay, so to wrap this up, in the narrowest sense possible, you might be able to use Bitcoin over HF by receiving blocks. Now, that requires having a Bitcoin beacon with a dedicated slice of HF spectrum, which is unlikely to happen legally, and introduces the same type of centralized infrastructure that we're trying to avoid in the first place. In any reasonable interpretation of being a participant in the Bitcoin network, you need the internet. That's just how it works. So the suggestion that blocks should be smaller, 300 kilobytes, in order to better serve passive participants in the network with a poor data communication method, I don't think it makes sense. I think that removing those points of control over infrastructure is a good impulse. Absolutely love the idea. And I hope that radio itself can play a role in that in the future. But I'm not going to hang my hopes on HF bands doing anything. I don't think there's enough bandwidth there. So for the foreseeable future, Bitcoin's fate is tied to the internet, and even something as radical as reducing block size by an order of magnitude won't change that. Guys, Bitcoin needs the internet, so let's do our best to make sure the internet stays as free and open as possible and not try to rely on HF radio, because I don't think that's going to work. Thanks.